Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the At Research webinar for today, June 24th, 2025. We're a couple of days post the solstice, so the day's starting to creep forward. A ceasefire has been announced between Iran and Israel, so an auspicious day to have a webinar. It's a pleasure to have so many of you join us today from around Australia. And of course, it's a great pleasure to be sharing some wonderful discussions about health services research. My name's Craig Underhill. I'm one of the co-investigators for the Revitalise Project's Regional Research Teaching Hub, who hosts the At Research website. Some of you may have been expecting to see Professor Maya Krishnasamy today, but unfortunately can't join us as a facilitator as planned. And then we had our program manager, Heather Cameron, lined up to do facilitate the discussion today. And unfortunately, Heather couldn't do that today because she's unwell, sends her apologies and best wishes for the panel and discussion. So just some housekeeping before we start. I'd like to commence uh, uh, on behalf of all of the team and all present today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the countries throughout Australia. I recognise their continuing connections to the lands, waters, communities, and pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island cultures and to elders past and present. And I extend a warm welcome to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today or viewing the recorded webinar. I'm on Wiradjuri country. You can see a drone shot there over Lake Hume, just east of Albury-Wodonga. And as I said, we have people from all across Australia joining us today. A couple of other housekeeping. There will be an opportunity to ask questions to the panel. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen rather than the chat. Doesn't matter really, but our preference is if you can do the Q&A. Don't be shy. Any question is worth asking. As we understand, this topic today is a bit of a grey area for many, so we hope there will be quite a lot of time for discussion. There will also be an evaluation circulated post-webinar and also available by QR code at the end of the webinar. We'll put that up on the screen. I encourage you to provide feedback, which we use to refine these webinars. And of course, there will also be access provided to the recording of this webinar via the At Research website. So if you want to watch back the webinar again, there's an option to do that, or please share it with any of your colleagues who you think may be interested in watching the webinar. So I'd like to now invite our panel to come from backstage onto the webinar. Here they all come. Great to see you all. So we have on our screen Professor Irene Blackberry. She is the John Richards Chair in Rural Ageing Research and Director of the Care Economy Research Institute at La Trobe University, and Irene's based in Albury-Wodonga. We also have Associate Professor Anne Woollett, the Clinical Trials Director at Trial Hub at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne, and Toby Matetwa-Pitt. I hope I said that right. Toby. Toby is a Senior Education Manager also at Trial Hub in Melbourne. Welcome to you all. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedules to join us today and to help shed some light on health services research and clinical trials. I'll just add for our audience that these three esteemed colleagues have amazing bios, which if you haven't done so already, it's worth a read on our website. At the At Research website. So this topic is one that's risen quite often for us at Research, partly because we're often explaining to audiences that as an initiative of the Revitalise project, At Research is focusing on health services research, whereas the other 6 initiatives are a combination of increasing clinical trial capacity, but also doing some health services research. So this issue about what's the difference between clinical trials and health services research has come up. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, possibly they're used inaccurately. So was an opportunity to have a discussion today about this topic and try and unpack it. So our first question to discuss, and maybe we'll go to Irene first, and then if Toby or Anne want to jump in. How do you define health services research studies, and how do you define clinical trials?
Thanks. Thank you, Craig, and thank you everyone, obviously, for joining us this afternoon. So I'm very pleased to be here, and certainly thank you for the invitation to be part of this and share my experience. So I guess to start off with the health services research, there are many definitions. Essentially, the key, I guess, component of that is a study. It's a multidisciplinary study that focuses on, things like, for example, access to care delivery, things like, for example, the quality of care, things like, the outcomes and also the cost of care. So the health services research, can be prospective, can be retrospective, there are many, I guess, parts of the multidisciplinary care research. And, one of them obviously is not just medical or clinical, but also includes things like, an economic evaluation. So it is common for health services research to work with health economists, to work with biostatisticians, to work with, for example, epidemiologists and so on. And the other key ingredients, apart from being a multidisciplinary study, is also about, the incorporation of social science into clinical science. So I might just stop in there, but certainly happy to, as we progress with our discussion, to share a bit more and give you some examples. But perhaps, Anne or Toby, can probably jump in here and give us your insights about clinical trials.
Thanks.
Who wants to go first? Anne, do you want to say?
I'm happy to go ahead, Craig. And I think this is a topical issue that we all struggle with. And the importance of this webinar today, I think, is the start of a much longer conversation about how we do sort of manage the difference between clinical trials and health services research. But I suppose for me, a clinical trial is really looking at a new intervention and to see if it's safe and acceptable for use. And it tends to be used, or it's prospectively looking, whereas, as Irene has mentioned, health services research is really around access and quality and cost effectiveness. And that can be either prospective or retrospective.
Thank you, Anne. Can I add also to that point? And I'm actually going to link in the point that you just highlighted, Irene, around social sciences into the link, the role of health services research as a social science linking clinical science. And as I was preparing for this, I was actually looking at the technical definition. I very firmly sit in the clinical trial space and looking at the technical definition of clinical trials. So we've got the ICH-GCP definition that I won't read to everybody, but it's very technical. It goes to the nitty-gritty of what we look at when an investigation of human subjects intended to discover or verify clinical pharmacological, other pharmacodynamics effects. And it goes into all of that work around interventions, which is what Anne has touched on. But I then read the definition from the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework, and I thought this actually had a very holistic element to it, and it actually touched on where we are going, where I'm hoping we're going to go with with our discussions today. That link of clinical trials with our health service research, and it says clinical trials provide early access to innovative treatments. So certainly including that GCP technical element and interventions for patients and improve the overall standard of medical care provided in our health services through the uptake of evidence into practice. I actually thought that actually is a definition that completes the whole cycle of what clinical trials should be. It's not just looking at efficacy, but then it's looking at how does that translate to our care. And I think it links in with what you've just said, Irene, is we have this element of the technical side where we're testing things, we're testing interventions, evidence-based practice, but how does that translate to impactful care, quality systems? And I thought that's a nice link to social science and clinical science.
We're going to talk a little bit more about the intersection between health services research and clinical trials in a minute, but I just wanted to add another point. I looked up, because I only found out about 2 hours ago that I was going to be facilitating this discussion today. I thought I was going to be observing. So I actually jumped on and looked at a couple of definitions of health services research. And the one that resonated with me is actually from the Health Services Research Association of Australia and New Zealand, or the ANZ, HSR, sorry, ANZ. So they define health services research as the study of the funding, organisation and delivery of health services, and involves multidisciplinary perspectives. The outcomes are usually at the population level rather than the individual level. So clinical research, clinical trials focus on the individual outcomes, whereas health services research takes that broader population level perspective. And you can't have one without the other, right? So health services research, this is really now talking about the intersection. So health services research helps with the implementation of the knowledge, how we can do that in an equitable way, in an efficient way, how we can better improve the organisation of health services and to implement that knowledge. And, you know, when you think about clinical trials are so important with generating that new knowledge, but the next step is so important. And that's where, coming from a regional perspective, we often miss out, because that if we could just translate that knowledge into practice, would make a huge difference in outcomes for our patients. And so I think that's, to me, that's a sort of important intersection between clinical trials or clinical research and health services research. But I'll throw it open to the panel about your thoughts about that intersection between these two fields. Anne, you're nodding. Do you want to say something? I noticed you dropped out before. Anne's in Bendigo on a borrowed desk, so may have some technical issues, and so apologies if we lose you again. And thanks for coming back.
I just wanted to back what you're saying, Craig. I think health services research is really looking about changing policy, or sort of focused on broader healthcare systems, whereas I think clinical trials is more focused on sort of, clinical interventions and change management of certain, medical conditions. So that's a nice explanation for me anyway.
Irene, do you want to add anything? Is there a divergence between health services research and clinical research, clinical trials, or do you think there's a convergence between the two?
Can I just probably add before, I guess, talking more about this clinical trials and health services research, is that, with the health services research, we can look at things, as you alluded to, Craig, not only at the individual level, so not only at the patient's level, but, normally when we do health services research, we do need to take into account, like the macro, the high level, the meso level. So macro level, things like, for example, the health system, so thinking more about, I guess, the funding, the policy. And then at the meso level, we normally look at, how the organization actually works, how the organization actually can support the delivery of care. We can look at things like, for example, like the workforce. Do you have the workforce to actually deliver the care models or not? And then at the individual levels, we can obviously look at the patients, but we can also look at, for example, the caregivers, who can also be the consumer of the care delivery. So it's much broader than the clinical trials. That's my experience, with health services research. And I think, in terms of, responding to your latest questions, Craig, about, the role of the health services research, I think the expectation nowadays, from the funding body or even from the government, when they implement a new model of care, or even, with the new, I guess, medical devices, medical technology, the questions has always been, is it feasible and implementable? So we have shifted a lot, I guess, like in the past, when I started, I guess, my research journey 20 odd years ago, the focus has always been that, we need to follow the gold standard, which is, mostly randomized control trials. We need to make sure that we know, I guess, we usually start from phase 1 clinical trials, depending on obviously the drugs or the medical devices, and then all the way to phase 4 clinical trials. But these days, and for those of you, who have obviously applied for funding, and I'm not just talking about the MRFF or NHMRC, even nowadays, when you apply for funding through the government, the expectation is much harder now. So it's no longer only about, showing that something is effective or safe and what's the outcomes or the effect, but also they would want to know about, how much does it cost to actually implement this? What kind of workforce, would be required to do this? What kind of level of commitment from the consumer, to actually uptake, this device or the drugs. So it's becoming more complex. And, one of the thing that I like about the health services research, particularly if it can be wrapped around clinical trials, is to actually giving you more of understanding about the context, particularly when I use a realist framework, for example, to actually understand the when, the how, the who. So goes beyond, showing that, something, a device or a drug or a new intervention program, whether it's a diet and physical activity, may actually work to produce an outcome.
Thank you. Toby.
If I can add to that, Irene, I think you've raised some valuable points, and I could not explain it as eloquently as you've done. My only testament into, and my only step into this space of health services research, I'm on an ethics committee, and I review some of these projects. But certainly, I agreed with you that there's actually more of a convergence in this space. But I like the idea that health services research does also come into evidence generation. And I think that's what you highlighted, that there is space where there's a look at the individual, but it flows into evidence implementation as well, which is where clinical trials in its purest form is not yet there. But also, as you were speaking, I realized, and you were talking about the changes that are happening, the mergers of clinical trials and health services research, is clinical trials are also changing. The approvals used to have this very neat phasing of, and I think Marion, she once presented on National Clinical Trials Day. We used to move neatly from phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. That doesn't happen anymore. Trials are being approved at phase 1. And part of that already, there's some elements of implementation planning that has a social look of how this drug will have impact in order to add evidence for that early approval. And the COVID trials as well, I think we're a part of that, where implementation had to be planned early as part. So there's this merger that is happening of the two concepts. I see it in my very novice view, and certainly granting value to each of these two sides. But I like where you touched, and I won't go too much into it, that however, there is a divergence when we look at health services. The governance of these two elements, I think, has to be appreciated, that it is different. And I think that is where I think Anne and I are coming and advocating for health service in what we're seeing, as we look at researchers coming in with research projects and clinical trials coming in. How do we govern these safely?
I'm just looking at the Q&A, and I know that we're going to focus on that at the end, but there's been a great question put in the chat there, put in the Q&A by Dana Schwiatek, and I think that we might do that now, because it sort of adds to this discussion about definition. So thanks for the question, Dana. Great questions as usual. I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on the distinct differences between health services research and clinical quality improvement initiatives across health services. Does it come down to differences in methodology, having a hypothesis-driven research question, or something else? So I think that's a really important question, because I think people who are doing quality improvement initiatives are doing health services research, probably without calling it that. Irene's nodding. Do you agree with that, Irene?
Yeah, well, to the best of my knowledge, the quality improvement, is part of the health services research. And quality improvement, obviously, can be clinical, if you look at the clinical parameters, but, at the same time, you can also look at non-clinical areas, could be something, for example, like the consumer or the patient's life experience, for example, of the care, could be around, I guess, like the caregivers, or, the support that the patients receive. So it can be many things, and obviously the health services research is a big umbrella, I guess. Now methodology, it depends. With the health services research, you can do both. You can do the qual, you can do the quant, you can do mixed methods as well. So I know that people often do a survey, in terms of asking for feedback. So that's probably the basic, I guess, form of I guess, part of a health services research. But, I think increasingly, health services research will involve qualitative. So meaning that, you can do focus groups. Usually you can do interviews, because obviously there is a lot of value to get, the actual journey and experience, and not just, I guess, the numbers or the quantitative data. And that's also part, I guess, of the quality indicators. I think in the past, it's very metric driven. But I do know that, because I do quite a lot of work in healthcare and aged care, for example, there is a strong value being put in place, in terms of the consumer experience and the consumer voice.
Yeah, but I think, Irene, people are doing improvement initiatives all the time on the coalface in the wards, and they want to bring in a new way of doing things, or maybe a new treatment, or using a new piece of equipment, or there's lots of different examples, or maybe bringing, starting to get some input from the consumers, for example. So there's lots of different ways you can do that. But I think really health services research helps sort of formalize that approach and makes the evaluation both quantitative or qualitative or mixed, as you said, more robust, because you're collecting all of the information, refining your processes. I think, to me, that's kind of main. I think, getting back to Dana's question, that to me, that's kind of the main difference between calling something a quality improvement initiative and health services research. It's just that sort of formalization of it, making it more robust. So, and there's a number of different frameworks that can be utilized to help people do that. You can explore some of those on the Out Research website for those watching today. They're particular easy to use, not too complex frameworks, Irene, that you like to use in the clinical setting?
So we touch on about implementation science, and look, for those of you who've never used it before, it's actually it can be quite daunting, I think. I found that the re-aim framework, I think is quite a useful thought process, to use, and a template, if you like, to think about, not only in terms of, like, what is the research questions, like what understanding, I guess, what is the problem? How are you going to approach that? So study design is very important. And I do, I guess, encourage, when you want to do a quality improvement activities in any areas, I guess, to probably approach a researcher, approach, a colleague, who actually has done that before, because I think it can look simple and easy, and I know a lot of people say that to me. Oh, I'll just do quality improvement. It's simple. It's nothing like doing clinical trials. Well, that's true, I guess. In the scheme of things, doing clinical trials is way more complicated, complex. It's much more regulated. But having said that, though, I think that, obviously there is a value to do a quality improvement or quality assurance activities, but in any case, it has to be done in the correct way. So the methods needs to be robust. And I think, using a framework like a RE-AIM, will help to guide, I guess, the thinking, the thought process, and also about, what data, people need to collect when, and also how to analyze them so that you can come up with, I guess, a conclusion that is actually valid. And this is, a lot of problems that I see, I guess, with the clinical trials, when the results is a negative trial, people in the past anyway, they always assume, oh, something is not effective, and therefore, it's a bad thing, But I think, 20 years on, I think we understand that, well, the product itself, the intervention itself, can actually or may actually be okay or be good. It's just that, if you can't actually implement that, this is, to do obviously with the fidelity on how, the intervention is being delivered through the trial, that can actually make or break the outcome of the trial.
Yeah, good points. Anne, did you want to jump in there with Toby?
Just briefly from me, Craig, I think for me, quality improvement is more of a localized, so a process or a practice improvement, whereas health services research is much more about system or, the broader healthcare system changes. So quality improvement tends to be within a department that they're looking to improve a practice or a process, and so it's much more localized, and whereas health services research is much more impactful, looking at system change. So it's a great step towards health services research, sort of informing how you might then undertake health services research. But I think what's really difficult in the healthcare system is the approval process. From my experience anyway, health services manage the recording and the approval of quality improvement in different ways. Some people still like it to go through a research governance office, and some people use a different system. And so as we're beginning out in this space, it is a little bit confusing about what the process is here. And I think there's some great work to be done to further unpack that.
Yeah, that's right. It's often confusing, isn't it? Like, oh no, that has to go through ethics because that's a health services research project, and that doesn't because it's quality improvement. It's like, again, that seems to be a very grey area. Toby, did you want to add anything? We're going to move on in a minute to the key challenges in doing the
Absolutely, and
research.
I won't be too long because Anne has
No,
already
but
said what I had in my Anne has already said what I had in my head. I had a conversation with one of my health service research expert, and it was this conversation around the drivers of the methodology will be what will be your outcomes? Are they going to be localized? And then you're looking at quality improvement. But one of the things he did highlight is I always encourage people to think about, if you think about publication, and then how do you then advance your project to become a system change? And then that's where I was envisioning it's then transitioning into health service research, and obviously all the pathways that Anne then highlighted that are a bit hazy for us around approvals and
yeah, it's a good point. And my point about asking Irene about the frameworks was, I think even if you're doing a localized, ward level quality improvement initiative, it's worth looking at those frameworks because it's like a checklist of all the things you need to think about, document to really have a robust conclusion for your project. And as Toby said, if you do put it through ethics, then there's also the opportunity to publish it and inform others about the outcomes. So, having said all that, what do you think the key challenges are for health services, particularly rural, remote, and regional health services, when they're working hard at delivering healthcare, but also want to develop their research units or departments? Do they aim for health services research or clinical trials, or a combination of both? I'm going to ask Anne first. So, in your experience, Anne, we're working with a lot of regional units as well as metro units. From a regional point of view, I think people should develop health services research first, or clinical trials, or a combination.
Well, I think the challenge with health services research is the expertise. So the health service doesn't always have the expertise like Irene has to help design and support the implementation of health services research. So I think that's a challenge, and where the opportunity for health services to partner with community, with universities, and use those partnership models for health services comes in, but it's not always, that pathway is not always well articulated, and it does need some work. So I think that's one of the challenges for emerging health services that are looking at, do we do clinical trials or do we do health services research to work through? In a way, clinical trials is lower hanging fruit because it comes to you as a protocol and you can implement it, and you've got a system, and you've sort of got the staff. Most clinicians have some interest in research and some knowledge of clinical trials to move forward, and there's perhaps more established long-standing resources to go with it. And the other piece from me is really around the sort of funding for health services research. You know, clinical trials tends to come with a funding stream. When you're first getting started, financial viability is the highest priority for many clinical trial units. Whereas when you're an established clinical trial unit and you've got a pathway, health services research is a really holistic rounding out, a way of enhancing and providing that sort of broader service. So I think it is a challenge for emerging and new health services. And I think it's a really completeness for established clinical trial services for the reasons that I've mentioned. You might not agree with me, Craig.
No, good point. No, I think ultimately you aspire to both, but as you say, when you're starting, yes, clinical trials often comes with a funding stream and a package that you follow. But I think there's also, as we just talked about in the last segment, opportunities maybe to formalize some of those quality improvement projects without, too much additional work. Irene or Toby?
I can probably add about the funding, I guess, a bit. I think I agree, obviously, and with the clinical trials, normally, I guess, it comes with the sponsor, so it's a sponsored trial. Obviously, yes, you can do investigator-initiated trial, and I've done it before, but it's obviously it still come with funding because the investigators would need to apply for that funding. Whilst, we do know that, with health services research, if you want to do quality assurance, the local one, yes, you can probably cover the cost of that, internally or, within a health service. But if you want to have, I guess, a much larger, I guess, like a change management, for example, into the organization or into the healthcare system, or even things like if you want to, I guess, train up, the workforce, to deliver a different kind of model, then it usually requires, a lot of funding. And for things like that, unfortunately, we do need to apply for funding, like competitive funding, like NHMRC, MRFF, or even, sometimes, we can get some funding, for example, from the local, like a local or state government, PHN sometimes, but mostly come from the Commonwealth funding. So along with that is, I guess I want to highlight about infrastructure. I think that, obviously clinical trials normally would require, quite a strong infrastructure at the health service, probably less so in terms of, the health services research. But I do agree with what Anne suggested that, having that, I guess, even if you don't have an in-house researcher, I guess, within the health service, but, if you can have a network or collaboration, I guess, with a local university, that usually helps a lot, to actually bring the local expertise, someone who's familiar with the health service, but also familiar with the community. And I think that's quite a key success to, whether you do clinical trials or health services research.
And just to add on to that, if I can just jump in with a very small point from my perspective, which is that workforce development or knowledge development. I think one of the challenges that our health services are facing, I think it's even a step maybe after you've made the decision that we are going to go for both, is that respect of the different levels of expertise that are needed to run these two programs. I think certainly I think, and that's what we are finding, that and that thought that easily health services research, we've got a clinical trial group, they can easily coordinate or manage that. Whereas it's a completely different expertise, it's a completely different pathways. And even as you're highlighting funding structures, I don't think that's readily known by health services as they are getting into this space. Clinical trials, same thing as well. It's not an easy pathway for somebody within health service to jump into clinical trials. There's a whole different skill set there. And I think that understanding of these different pathways that, yes, converge in some ways in terms of the principles, but the governing, the managing, the running of them, and initiation and the infrastructure that you do need, even when Anne was highlighting the partnerships that you will need to have, you almost need to understand the skill sets that you need in order to then strategically reach out for those partnerships, reach out for that mentor, reach out for that expertise to come into your health service, to come into your organization.
Yeah, so we have a question about
yeah.
yeah, thanks, Toby. We've got a question about funding, so we might do that now, actually. So, it's interesting when you think about, there is often some funding that comes for clinical trials, but not really for health services research. And clinical trials unit have the ability to become self-funding through sponsored studies, and they don't really exist in the health services research space. So maybe this is a bit of a loaded question, but what do you think the federal and state government health departments need to be doing to improve the support they give to both health services research and clinical trials, especially for regional, rural, remote, and palliative care services? Who wants to start with that one? I know, fun fact too, I think under the NHMRC system, less than 10%, or it might be less than 5% of health service research focused grant applications are successful. So, we've talked about the importance of taking interventions and implementing them, but those grants, are often so not well funded under the current system. So, Irene, did you want to say anything about the funding for health services research?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So, well, I think, look, I think MRF5 certainly did try to make sure that, it becomes more equitable, I guess, to access these research grants. In the last probably at least 2 years or so that I'm aware of, like there's a specific call for researchers in the rural area. Whilst, it's obviously good, and, they've got the latest one around having the early career and mid-career researchers grant only. I think that, the bottom line to me is about, a much stronger investment, because, like you said, Craig, even with, all of the initiatives, in reality, I guess, with the rural and regional research is that, the workforce is not, I guess, the number is small to begin with. And then, the even within the available pool, I guess, you do not have that expertise, as, you would easily get, for example, in the metro, Health economists would be a good example. I mean, even in metro, it's difficult to find one, let alone, in the rural area. So I think there needs to be probably a more, I guess, investment that, the government needs to put in place in terms of, supporting research and clinical trials in the rural and regional area. And I think that, a good example, which you can obviously share with us, Craig, is that Revitalize project, which is an MRFF infrastructure grant. And obviously, thanks to your leadership, like we have achieved a lot, in the last, four years or so. But, we do need to have, I guess, investment to that magnitude, really, to make a difference. Because if you just, fund something, over 6 months, 12 months, 100,000 here and there, I don't think it will change anything, really.
Yeah, that's right. These are often longer term projects, aren't they? They're multi-year projects, and sustaining them is a difficult thing when you don't have the opportunity to receive non-government sponsors that other fields would have. Maybe you and I need to, or all of us need to, write a paper about the value of health services research and why there needs to be some kind of core funding commitment, because it's really going to save the health services a lot of money at the end of the day. Irene's leading care economy, huge new care economy grant. So and that's really going to help hopefully drive some efficiencies and cost savings through health services research on how to more efficiently deliver care right across the Australian economy. Toby or Anne? Oh, go on.
Can
Irene.
I just add about the issue around sustainability, I guess, well, we need to make sure that, once something has started, that, there is an ability, I guess, for everyone to actually continue that. So I think the issue around impact and sustainability beyond, I guess, the short-term outcomes, I think will be quite important to, I guess, argue the case in terms of, what is the return on investment, I guess.
Exactly. Toby or Anne, funding for health services research important?
I think I'm just seconding Irene's point, especially the very last one you said, the sustainability was going to be my comment, actually, Irene. I look at the funding structures that are currently there within our regions. They are all based on implementation. Let's bring in this, but the nature of them actually do not support sustainability. They are short term. I don't think 2, 3, 4 years is enough to enable sustainability. It takes a couple of years to actually map out what is needed, then to develop a system to embed. By the time you've embedded, that's the end of the funding, and there's a break in that continuance, and that cycle starts again. So I think sustainability planning in any funding structure, I think, will be quite important. I think there's a statement as well that I had in one of the discussions we had yesterday, and it supports what you said as well, Irene, the value add of research within a health service. I think it was a very nice statement, and I keep highlighting that on the value of health service in improving our health, the whole health, I think the whole organization as a whole, I think, needs to be part of that as foundational assessment as well. So.
Right. Thanks, Toby. Anne?
I think just from me, I think everyone's covered it off really well, Craig. I think there's a little bit of work potentially to be done to understand what that investment would look like, so government is more clear about what you're asking for investment to look like. So what does the optimal investment in health services research look like? It's funding for specific projects, but what's the underpinning sort of infrastructure needs? That's well defined in clinical trials. So, is it health economists? Is it statisticians? Is it health services researchers? So government understands what you're looking for to invest in as well. And I think potentially a nice paper.
maybe we need to start putting some quotas in place. And, when you think about big business, there's benchmarks for what they should invest in research and development. So maybe 2%, 3% of their budget needs to be in R&D. And that drives productivity gains. And so same in health, we kind of expect innovation and new things just to happen. So maybe there needs to be some, and clinical trials units can be self-sustained, but maybe there needs to be some kind of percentage in a health budget, 2%, that's devoted to research. Anyway, we're running out of time, but we've got a couple of important questions to do. If we wanted to take a moment for an emerging researcher, wanted to give them some advice, if they're looking at doing some research for the first time in their health, in their workplace, how do they unpack what health services research and clinical trials means, and how do they decide between choosing a clinical trial or doing a health services research project?
I think, Craig, it's a great opportunity to plug at research, isn't it?
Well, I was hoping someone would.
So for me, I think when Toby and I first were talking to the Revitalised team, we were talking that there's sort of AC Tech and there's lots of wonderful platforms for online learning around clinical trials. And then there's the At Research, which has got an amazing resources for health services research. And I think there's a really lovely piece about that decision tree about when do you go to At Research and when do you go to other sort of modules to help early career researchers understand what that sort of entry decision tree looks like. Because At Research now has got over 500 resources, really amazing resource, but I think not everyone knows what it's there, and that initial decision tree to help people know which pathway to take would be a lovely piece of work that we've talked about.
Yeah, if Heather was here, she would be able to answer this as well. But that's our next, in the next several months, that's our next sort of project, is to develop up some pathways through the website. So if you're a novice or you've had some experience with health services research, or you consider yourself to be more experienced about where to go, we might label each of the modules with beginner, intermediate, advanced, so that to help guide people through the website. Or if you want to start somewhere, this is where you start. These are the first key modules to look at. So that's our next initiative, Anne, as we've curated up quite a number of resources, now trying to catalog them, I guess, or to organize them a bit better.
Can I just ask, Craig, in addition to that, is there a way, I guess, for people to network, I guess, or like, developing like a community of practice as such, I guess, where I think there's a second question there about, obviously clinicians are busy, and I guess, it's important to, I guess, have that connection, I guess, and to collaborate. Sometimes people don't know, who to contact, even if you work, say, like, you are at Bendigo Health at the moment, and, for Bendigo Health people, for example, to know who to contact, I think it's not always, I guess, clear, like, who's the right person to do this. So I'm just wondering whether there is an opportunity, I guess, within at research to actually have that, I guess, potentially, connecting people, I guess, so people can see who are the members and, what are some of their area of interest and skills and experience, I guess, and then start making the connection. Because for me, I mean, being, well, I'm a clinical trialist, but, mostly health services research. I do a bit of both, but mostly in the health services research stuff. I have a medical background, but I haven't actually worked clinically as a medical for many, many years. So I do actually value to have the input from clinicians on the ground, and I'm just not talking about medical practitioners. I'm talking about, nurses, I'm also talking about allied health people, to actually let me know what are some of the problems. And then, you know, the way I do my research is normally I then co-design the actual research, you know, with a group of people, including the clinicians, including the consumers, about, you know, understanding the problems, understanding the context and the content, and then coming up with a proposed solution that we could trial together. So it's not, I guess, a simple process, you know, but it's a much more collaborative process, you know, to come to a research project.
Yeah. So we've had some discussion about that community practice idea, Irene. So on our Research website, there's an opportunity tab, and there's a opportunity to actually be mentored through the HSA, HSR at AANZ, the Health Services Research Association of Australia and New Zealand. I and people, there's a contact us section too. People can write in, and we can help put people in touch. We haven't gone down that community practice path as yet. We did explore it a little bit with some what we call the research cafes, which was a set time to come in and ask questions. The ACCN, the Australian Comprehensive Cancer Network, has really good website and discussion pages, and there's some discussion about maybe within that we set up a community practice and discussion board, particularly for health services research, which would be in cancer, but to have the discussion board there. So rather than doing it as part of our research. So watch this space. We'll let people know through our newsletter what's happening there. I think we're running out of time. There's one last question, and then we'll go to a question in the Q&A. So what's your take-home message for our audience today about health services research and clinical trials? So a take-home message for the researchers, and a take-home message for health department personnel or the decision makers. I'm going to start the bottom of my screen. And take-home message. Go to the @research website. Is that what you...
Absolutely, and I think there's it's also the organisational culture about the value of health services research and clinical trials.
Thank you. Toby? Any take-home message for the research or
absolutely,
decision-makers?
absolutely, Craig. I was actually going to highlight the Eight Research platform. I think is valuable. I think that's an incredible tool that we've now got, and highlighting the value of this of research in our practice, but also we now have ACTech. So we now have health services and clinical trials now freely available resources to guide the expertise and the growth of these two areas within a health service. But for me, was that respect of the different skill sets that we need as we are looking at health service and clinical trials, but also respecting that there's a convergence to these two worlds. And there's a value add to each as you get to understand research. It actually improves your clinical trials practice, and clinical trials also is now being, I think, made more rapid and more efficient by the embedding of that social science. In it, and this health service going forward, I think it's looking at combining the both, but creating those that infrastructure that actually enables both to succeed effectively. I suppose is the word.
Take-home message, Irene.
So people always ask me about, why is it I left, being a medical practitioner and then move on to research after I've done my PhD. Well, one of the things, I guess, for me is about, through research, you can actually change, at scale. When you see, your patients, there's nothing wrong being a clinician. I'm not trying to undermine the clinicians. Obviously, you can improve things one at a time. With research, yes, understand that it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time to change the outcomes. However, though, I think we need to understand that it gives you the opportunity to, I guess, improve yourself, to grow, to learn. At least for me, like over the last 20 odd years, every time I involve with other people, I learn from them. So to me, it's obviously it's a give and take sort of relationship. I share my experience, but also I learn from other people. But also, I guess, at the end of the day, it's improving the outcomes, for the person and the families, the workforce, and the health system. So that's really, I guess, for me is the motivation as to, why on earth you want to bother with research. And I think, everyone should, consider doing research. You need to start small, obviously. Understand, if you're clinicians, you're busy. But that's, I guess, the value of connecting with other people. That's the value of, being part of a network. And I think that, it's great to see quite a lot of people in here. And certainly, it's an opportunity, I guess, to learn from each other.
Yeah, I'd encourage everybody to try and get involved in some form of health services research, offer to help with projects around the health service, to learn the processes, etc. Because I think, look, to me, it's really, as I've got older and hopefully wiser, I think you can achieve more through doing this than just squeezing another patient into the clinic. It's really can be very powerful to be trying to change things at a systems level. So one last question to finish off from Kate Booth. Thanks, Kate, for sending this in. Funding is one important factor for sustainability, but it's also about time. So many clinicians I talk to would love to do research or clinical trials, but they simply don't have the time. How do we change that, especially the health services employing BMOs? It's a great question. I think we need to be advocating for protected time within awards. I know for doctors sometimes do get that protected time. Nursing staff, it's really difficult. There's lots of modules that people want to use to learn, but they're really expected to do that in their own time. And I think we need to turn the system around and ensure that people do get some protected time. So anyone want to say anything about that, or everyone nodding in agreement? Nods in agreement. I'm now just going to quickly share my screen in closing. And I've got, can't see my share screen button, so maybe I won't worry about that. Here we go. Just to ask everyone, please just take only a couple of minutes to fill in the survey, which is on this QR code. Hopefully you can see that on your screens. So please just take a minute to do the survey for us. And if you're not already familiar with that research website, have a look at that, sign up to the weekly, very brief newsletter, which will keep you informed in new initiatives and updates on the website. So I think in closing, it's just now for me to thank very much our three panelists, Professor Irene Blackberry, Toby Pethwa Pitt, and Associate Professor Anne Wallett. Thanks very much, all of you, for taking time out to do this session. Thanks to all the people around Australia who have taken the time during their lunch break to listen in and watch this session. Please share it with your colleagues if you think it's of value. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for sharing, Craig.
Thank you.